There is a kind of man the world cannot ignore, not because he demands attention, but because his presence removes the need for noise. He walks into a room and doesn't speak first. He doesn't need to. There is something in him, measured, still, deeply grounded, that makes people adjust their posture without realizing it. They don't know why they want him around. They just do, not for entertainment, not for validation, but because when he's there, something feels right again. That man doesn't arrive by accident. He is built in silence, tested in pain, and forged by choices no one applauded. Zeno of Citium did not discover Stoicism in a classroom. He didn't invent it through comfort. He found it after losing everything, after a shipwreck scattered the life he once knew. Most men break when the ship sinks. He began. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He wandered into a bookstore, wet, ruined, anonymous, and found Socratic philosophy, not theory, not words. Salvation. That is the beginning of real presence. When the external crumbles, and instead of scrambling to rebuild the same walls, you go inward and start to build a soul that won't collapse again. Zeno never became loud. He never needed to dominate. His life was a lesson in direction, not assertion. He didn't push. He pulled, with gravity. The quieter he became, the more others leaned in. And over time, that stillness became architecture, expanded and fortified by Chrysippus, a man who used logic like stone. Together, they gave the world something we rarely talk about anymore: emotional weight that doesn't require emotional noise. We live in a time where men are taught to earn their place through usefulness, to fix everything, to explain themselves constantly, to be emotionally available until they disappear inside the very relationships they wanted to hold. But usefulness is not presence. Usefulness fades. Presence remains. This video isn't about popularity. It's not about tricks or charm or saying the right words. It's about becoming so internally whole that when you leave a room, it feels like the lights dimmed. The Stoic blueprint is not cold detachment. It's sacred clarity. It begins the moment you stop trying to be liked and start becoming aligned. There's nothing louder than a man who's grounded in silence. A man who has stopped chasing. A man who has stopped explaining. A man who has lost everything and chosen, instead of rebuilding for others, to finally build himself. When you become that man, your presence does something. It changes the emotional temperature of every room you enter. Zeno didn't ask to be followed. He became the kind of man people followed without knowing why. Not because he had answers, but because he had survived the storm and didn't flinch when the thunder came back. That's the man we're building now. Quiet, weight-bearing, unshakable, and the world will feel it when you walk in, or more importantly, when you walk out. There's a pattern most men fall into without even knowing it. It starts small. You help. You show up. You fix what's broken. You make yourself useful. At first it feels right. Masculine, responsible, grounded. But slowly that usefulness becomes expectation. That expectation becomes routine. And one day, you look around and realize no one really sees you anymore. You've become necessary, but not valued. Present, but not felt. Reliable, but not remembered. That's the invisible habit. Equating your worth with your function. Becoming a tool in the lives of others, instead of a presence they choose to feel. Being needed is not the same as being wanted. There's a quiet death that happens when a man ties his identity to usefulness. The more you fix, the less they notice you. The more you give, the more they expect. And somewhere in that rhythm of doing everything right, you lose the very thing that made you whole: your emotional gravity, your ability to make others pause simply by being there. Respect doesn't come from usefulness, it comes from rootedness, from being a man who isn't pulled by need, but anchored by stillness. Neuroscience calls it role fatigue, the silent erosion of identity from always being the one who holds the pieces together. It's not that they don't care, it's that you've trained them to expect your absence in the form of your constant giving. Mirror neurons fire not just when we feel something, but when we notice someone holding space with dignity. That space, that's what disappears when you become all function, no essence. You don't attract loyalty by solving problems. You attract it by being immovable in the storm. People trust what doesn't shake. They lean into what doesn't beg. They remember what made them feel steady. That's what presence is. Not noise, not performance. Just quiet, unyielding presence. When you become that, they won't just want you around. They'll wonder why everything feels emptier when you're gone. There's a moment in every man's life when he crosses a line he didn't know existed. He sends the text first. He explains himself one more time. He compromises again, not because he's weak, but because he's trying to hold on to something that's already slipping. That effort, reaching, proving, justifying, it doesn't bring connection. It dissolves dignity. And the more you chase, the more invisible you become. Emotional overextension isn't seen as care. It's felt as desperation. It makes your presence feel conditional, performative, easily shaken. And somewhere deep inside, she feels it too. Not consciously, but emotionally. She doesn't feel your presence. She feels your panic. And that panic whispers one thing. You're afraid to lose her because you've already lost yourself. The Stoics never taught withdrawal as avoidance. They taught it as respect. Respect for your own soul. There's a kind of silence that doesn't punish. It purifies. When you stop reaching, something happens. You stop explaining. You stop convincing. And in that pause, you reclaim your weight. The man who can walk away doesn't need to. The man who's willing to be misunderstood becomes unforgettable. There's biology behind this too. Studies show that men who overgive, who constantly extend without receiving, actually experience oxytocin depletion. The same chemical that bonds us begins to erode when it's never reciprocated. You don't just get tired, you lose the internal bond with yourself. So the man who stops chasing isn't cold, he's healing. He's realigning with the only voice that ever mattered, his own. He's not withholding love, he's refusing to spend it where it won't grow. That kind of presence doesn't beg to be kept. It dares to be felt, and when it's gone, it leaves behind a silence that lingers longer than any words. It never happens during the argument. It never happens in the loud moments. It happens in the quiet, unnoticed ones, when she looks at you and feels nothing. Not hate, not anger, just a slow, invisible shift, because something in you stopped holding weight. Not because you changed, but because you never stood for anything unshakable to begin with. You were there, but you were floating. Presence isn't about proximity, it's about gravity. And women, whether they admit it or not, are constantly searching for it, testing for it, not to hurt you, but to locate something firm in a world of noise. When you bend too often, when your boundaries evaporate the moment tension arrives, when every belief becomes negotiable, she notices, maybe not all at once, but she feels it, the absence of center, the lack of inner anchor. And when that realization hits, respect begins to quietly fade. There was a man, he did everything right. He showed up, he provided, he supported. But she left anyway. She, not because he failed, but because he had no compass, no sacred line he wouldn't cross, no internal weight that made her feel safe in his silence. She didn't leave him for another man. She left him for the absence he had become. Zeno understood this long before modern psychology gave it names. He taught that without a logos, an internal law, you are just a leaf in emotional weather. You drift. You react. You adapt too easily. And in doing so, you disappear. A man must have a code that does not shift with her moods, her fears, or her tests. Not to dominate her, but to remain himself in her storm. That's what makes a man irreplaceable. Not that he loves the loudest, but that he carries something unmoved, something sacred, something silent, something that tells her, without words, I won't lose myself to keep you. And that is the moment she feels safe again. Not because you held her tighter, but because you finally held yourself. Most men were taught early that their value lives outside of them, that if they stay quiet, they'll be accepted, that if they stay useful, they'll be loved. Praise didn't come for being, it came for behaving, for fixing, for not needing. And so, without knowing it, they built a life around one quiet belief. If I am not enough for them, I am nothing. That conditioning doesn't leave easily. It follows a man into every relationship, every conversation, every room. He doesn't speak his truth. He scans for approval. He doesn't stand firm. He adjusts. He becomes a mirror of what others want, instead of a reflection of who he really is. And the tragedy is this: in trying to be enough for everyone, he vanishes. This is where Stoic philosophy doesn't just explain, it rebuilds. The value hierarchy is simple: internal over external, essence over image, integrity over popularity. You don't ask, do they like me? That question chains you to their emotions. Instead, you ask, am I aligned with my inner command? That question sets you free. A man who leads with alignment doesn't need loudness. His presence speaks before he does. People feel it, because he's no longer trying to be chosen. He's already chosen himself. That kind of man doesn't have to prove his worth. He lives it, quietly, steadily, without performance. And yes, it will cost you. It will cost you approval. It will cost you certain relationships. It might even cost you the comfort of being liked. But what you gain is not small. You gain the ground beneath your feet. You gain the man who was buried under years of proving and pleasing. You gain yourself. That's magnetism, not charm, not manipulation, just alignment. And when a man is fully aligned, people don't know why they trust him. They just do, because he is no longer a reaction. He is a reminder of what it means to be whole. There's a moment in every man's story where he stops talking, not out of defeat, but out of decision. He no longer explains his pain. He no longer negotiates his worth. He no longer seeks permission to feel what's real. That moment isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes in silence. And yet, it changes everything. Emotional authority doesn't begin when others start listening. It begins when you no longer need them to, when you decide quietly and without fanfare that your inner world matters more than external validation, that your boundaries don't need to be justified, that your dignity isn't up for debate, that your voice isn't something to trade for peace. It is the peace. There was a father, years ago. He yelled to be heard, to command, to protect, to maintain control, until one day he stopped, not because he didn't care, but because he finally saw the cost. The more he raised his voice, the less anyone listened. The more he explained, the less they respected. So he stopped yelling, and the house grew quieter, not just in volume, but in energy. He became the calm in the center of the storm, and they began to listen. Not because he demanded it, but because his silence carried weight. That's what real power looks like. It's not the ability to dominate a room. It's the discipline to remain grounded in one, to know your truth so deeply, you no longer offer it up for discussion. To act, not out of impulse, but out of internal clarity. That is the essence of Stoic choice. Not passive endurance, but surgical precision. You stop performing. You start embodying. From that moment on, everything shifts. Not instantly, but steadily. People feel it. They respond differently. They speak softer. They interrupt less. Not because you've become aggressive, but because you've become rooted. And in that rootedness, you teach them, without a word, how to treat you. What you stop doing defines you. When you stop chasing, people begin to come closer. When you stop justifying, people begin to respect. When you stop yelling, your presence starts to echo. And in that stillness, you become something the world rarely sees. A man who commands not through fear, but through gravity. We've been told that showing up all the time means we care, that answering every message, attending every call, being constantly available, proves love. But availability without boundaries isn't intimacy, it's emotional erosion. When your presence is always expected, it begins to lose meaning, not because you're not valuable, but because value disappears when there's no space to feel it. Strategic unavailability isn't a tactic. It's not a game. It's how a man maintains his emotional hygiene. Just like the body needs rest, the soul needs distance. Intermittent absence calibrates relationships. It resets emotional rhythms. It allows others to recalibrate how they experience you, because what is always present becomes background noise. Science affirms what wisdom has always known. Dopamine rises not from constant access, but from anticipation. Space creates contrast, and in contrast, presence becomes impact. When you are always there, your emotional temperature blends into the room. When you disappear, quietly, respectfully, intentionally, you teach people how your presence affects the room in the first place. But this isn't about withholding affection. It's about protecting your own center. The man who never leaves the emotional front lines doesn't look strong. He looks exhausted. And exhaustion is not leadership. It's a warning sign. A man who disappears to restore himself doesn't cause harm. He prevents it. Because when he returns whole. You're not being difficult when you take space. You're being disciplined. You're showing others that you are not an endless resource, that your time is sacred, that your energy is earned. And in doing so, you raise the value of your presence. Not artificially, but honestly. Presence without scarcity becomes pressure. It starts to feel like obligation, but presence after absence, that feels like truth, like medicine, like home. And that is the difference between being available and being remembered. There comes a time when you realize words aren't enough. You've explained. You've reasoned. You've pleaded in silence and out loud, but nothing changes. And so, one day, you stop. Not in anger, not in punishment, but in understanding. You walk away, not to teach a lesson, but because staying would mean abandoning yourself. Absence has a language of its own. It speaks slowly, firmly, without noise, and while words can be debated, silence cannot. You don't need to argue about your value. You simply stop standing where you're not seen, and suddenly, the space you leave behind does the talking. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy. Embody it." That's what absence is. Embodiment. Of boundaries, of worth, of self-respect. When you leave with dignity, you teach more than any sentence ever could. You don't force anyone to understand. You simply let your absence reveal what your presence was holding together. Some will not feel it at first. That's okay. Absence works slowly. It seeps into the spaces where you used to listen, where you used to soften, where you used to shrink, and over time, the echo of who you were begins to press against their silence, not as revenge, but as reality. This isn't about playing hard to get. It's about remembering what you forgot. You were never meant to stay where your soul is drained. You were meant to carry your truth like a weight, to give only what grows, not what disappears. Emotional neutrality isn't detachment. It's refusing to abandon yourself just to keep the peace. She may never say it. She may never admit it, but she'll feel it. The difference between your presence and the void it leaves. Because absence is not the end of a connection. Sometimes it's the first honest part of it. And when a man learns to let silence speak for him, he stops proving and starts being remembered. Zeno's life wasn't marked by dominance. It wasn't built on charisma or power or noise. It was shaped by restraint. After the shipwreck, after the ruin, after the loss, he didn't rebuild his old life. He built something deeper, something still, something others could feel just by being near him. And the quieter he became, the more others gathered around him. Not for answers, but for the calm he carried. Marcus Aurelius lived that same paradox. An emperor, a warrior, a ruler of nations, who ruled not by fear, but by moral gravity. His journals were not declarations of conquest. They were reflections of the soul. His weight didn't come from titles. It came from clarity, from the kind of presence that doesn't rise or fall with applause. A man becomes irreplaceable not because he is loud, but because he is rare. Because in a world that pulls at your attention, your energy, your very sense of self, he stands, not rigidly, but rooted. He knows who he is, he knows what he carries, and he no longer needs the world to confirm it. That is the weight of silence. That is the power of presence. It's not built in a single day. It's built in the moments you choose not to react, in the words you don't say, in the emotions you feel but don't let own you, in the decisions made quietly over time until one day, without effort, your presence becomes the calm in someone else's storm. When your silence is grounded, your absence becomes sacred. You don't force people to want you. You become the man they feel safer with than without. You become the one who doesn't chase, but is remembered. The one who doesn't demand respect, but commands it by simply being. They'll want you around. Not because you asked for it, but because when you are, everything feels more real.